This week on the Communicators, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, the senior policy advisor of John McCain for president. This is the second of two programs looking at the technology and telecommunications plans of the presidential candidates.
To give us a sense of John McCain's approach to telecommunications and technology, this week we welcome to the Communicators Douglas Holtz-Eakin, the senior policy advisor for John McCain for president. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Joining alongside of me to help with the guest host this week is Amy Schatz, telecommunications reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Amy, thanks to you.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Holtz-Eakin, if there was a general way to describe how John McCain approaches issues of technology and telecommunications, how would you frame that up? How would you describe that?
Well, I think there would be two important points that he would stress. Number one, you can't draw a line between technology policy or telecommunications policy and the economy as a whole. I mean, this is an integral part of American life at this point, and you have to have policies that are supportive in every dimension. And the second is that John McCain wants things to be good for the American family, for the consumer, and he will regulate where necessary to make sure that they get a fair deal. But there's a great track record of innovation and a great track record of growth in the U.S. that you want to maintain and improve on so that we get the vast variety of new products that we've seen historically.
From his experience before when he served on the Commerce Committee, are there ways that you can describe to our folks approaches that he's taken from his past experience on issues looking at telecom and technology?
Well, I think a central piece of his experience was the 1996 Telecommunications Act, where there was an attempt to have a broad-scale reform of telecommunications in the United States. I think there was consensus that it was needed at that point in time. But as the debate went on, Senator McCain became more and more convinced that in the end, that act would be too beneficial for large entrenched interests, the existing telephone companies. It would not provide the innovation, the competition, and the benefits to consumers that were at the heart of the promise. And in the end, he opposed the act. And I think history has proven he saw this correctly, and that since that time we've unwound a great deal of that act in order to get the kinds of innovations that we see out in the marketplace today.
How does Senator McCain keep track of the changes in these worlds, considering when he worked back in '96 and considering the modern day where things seem to be changing rapidly moment by moment?
He's more in touch with America than any other human being I know. He's the best retail politician in America. He does town halls on nearly a daily basis. In the primaries, he did over 100 in the state of New Hampshire alone. He is in touch with everything that is happening on the ground. And when people ask questions, they often say, well, I was in a store and I saw this product. He gets a lot of feedback and is really monitoring closely at the most retail level what's happening in America.
Amy Schatz, go ahead.
You talk about how he's really in touch with Americans. I think one of the perceptions that's been growing, and it's one that's been sort of pushed by Democrats too, is that the senator doesn't use the internet. There was a blogger who recently wrote a story for Salon.com talking about John McCain internet dunce. Does the senator actually use the internet, and is it a problem, do you think, that he's not using it as much as maybe most of the other Americans who would be voting for him?
I do think that, as a political matter, we've seen a pretty aggressive attempt to, by the opposition, to portray John as out of touch somehow with the technology community, when in fact he has a superb record from his time in Congress and in general on technology issues. And he is in touch with what Americans are doing on the internet. He has a family. He has kids that use the internet. He's got a daughter, Megan, who's got a blog about the campaign. She travels with him, has a videographer. He's surrounded by this. Nevertheless, there's been a political attempt to portray him as not understanding this issue.
Do you think that's an unfair characterization?
I think it's an unfair characterization. I mean, I've heard extreme things like, John McCain has never sent an email. I mean, it's just not true.
Okay, so recently Senator McCain sort of launched his technology plan. Can you sort of talk us through sort of the highlights?
Oh, the plan will be up on his website today, and it's a broad vision. It's a vision that talks about the need for innovation, because innovation will be at the heart of our success in addressing climate change. It'll be at the heart of our success in dealing with our energy challenges, our health care reforms, education for the future. And so one needs to think comprehensively. Tax policies which keep the reward to innovation low, the protection of intellectual property, both in the United States, where we do need patent reform, around the globe, where patents and copyrights are an essential part of trade policies, the regulation issues that come up so many times, consumer protection, the privacy of their data, the safety of children on the internet. It's a very comprehensive document.
If I can follow up, one of the elements of it is a 10% tax credit for research and development. Can you give us how Senator McCain came to that conclusion and why he thinks that's an important element of the plan?
The government has a long and appropriate role in doing basic research and providing incentives for research and development in the United States. Unfortunately, in the Senator's view, we haven't done a very good job with our existing R&D tax credit or R&E tax credit. If you look at it, it has some of the worst characteristics of Washington-based policymaking. Number one, it's incredibly complicated, a very difficult formula to understand for the average human being. Number two, in an area of policy which is fundamentally about the future and long-term investments, the R&D tax credit is extended every year, and really it becomes a Washington game. You go out and you ask for campaign contributions, you go back to Washington, extend the tax credit for a year, then you go back out and hold them up for another year's contributions. And the Senator's opposed to this. This is the problem with Washington. He wants a permanent credit. He wants it to be simple. It's 10%, very generous credit for the compensation of R&D employees working in the United States. Because the evidence is, if we do the R&D in the United States and the headquarters in the United States, we'll produce those products in the United States as well.
When talking about these and formulating that, did he talk directly with Silicon Valley folks themselves about how they would perceive this plan?
I think one of the nice features of John McCain as a policymaker is his approach to talking to experts directly. It's a legacy of being a chairman on the Commerce Committee, where you can call experts to the witness table, and he likes to call experts who disagree to the witness table, start the debate, learn from the debate, and he doesn't need to have information funneled to him. He'll talk directly to experts, develop opinions, and then make policy decisions on the basis of that.
Can you share some of the folks that he talked with?
Well, he's probably talked to more people than I could name, quite frankly, because he'll pick up the phone and call the people he's interested in. But he's gotten direct advice, obviously, from the John Chambers of the world. He's talked to Meg Whitman. He's been out to Silicon Valley and held broad roundtables on 2 occasions during the campaign. And the advice of all those individuals filtered into his decision-making.
So let's switch to everyone's favorite telecom topic, net neutrality. And can you explain to us what Senator McCain's position is on net neutrality?
His position is that aggressive and prescriptive legislation on net neutrality is not desirable at this time. It's premature. There is yet no demonstrable damage from practice that a net neutrality legislation would solve. So his preferred way to address issues like this is let the marketplace develop, watch for and be aggressive about monitoring for abusive practices, for monopoly power, for unfair representation to consumers. And if you find such behavior, apply a remedy and get damages. But that's an approach that doesn't pretend to know in advance what's the business model of tomorrow, what's the product line for tomorrow, and who will be providing that product.
You know, recently the FCC got into this very issue with a complaint about Comcast, which was accused of blocking some of their customers who were using peer-to-peer file sharing services. Did Senator McCain agree with what the FCC did in fighting against Comcast?
He hasn't taken a position on that particular case, and we haven't put out any response on that.
But wouldn't that be sort of what he's talking about in his plan? If you're not going to have legislation, that you'd have to have one of the agencies sort of, be the enforcer, right? So.
Oh, absolutely. There is a need for a framework within which the market will operate, and that framework includes regulations that define market practices and have some oversight of them.
Before the FCC decision, Ed Markey of the House Telecom and Internet Subcommittee and others were looking at legislation looking at these efforts. What about legislative efforts to make sure that proper information is getting across the Internet? How would the Senator respond to that?
The Senator's approach would be to, number one, encourage private firms to develop a best practice model and industry self-regulation. If that's insufficient, you'd want to give the authority to an oversight body such as the FCC to write standards of information sharing and give them authority to enforce it. And as a last step, try to codify it in statutory language, which has the disadvantage of being inflexible and not as malleable for changing market circumstances.
Can I ask a question about the FCC in general then? What's Senator McCain's approach on how the FCC should function?
He thinks that the FCC has got to always be looking forward and trying to anticipate where the boundaries are going to shift and make sure that it's not looking backwards, it's not tied to a regulatory model that is built on an industry structure of the past. The most important thing about the FCC is it lies at the heart of what has been a tremendous creative force in the American economy, and it needs to foster that creativity in an effective way.
Does he have any thoughts specifically on Kevin Martin's management of the FCC?
The senator hopefully at one point will be president, and he'll have lots of personnel decisions to make, but that's all premature at this point.
I think one of the things that Senator McCain has been very active on in the last few years on telecom policy is on cable and a la carte pricing, and he's been very vocal about the thought that Americans spend way too much to pay for cable, and he's talked a lot about Congress passing laws to require cable companies to offer channels individually or a la carte. Does he still share that view, and as in a McCain administration, what would he do about that?
I believe that's a classic example of John McCain's view of the appropriate role of government, which is look out into the landscape, and if you see concentrations of power, find ways to ameliorate the exercise of that power. In his view, cable companies have had far too much authority and monopoly power in many marketplaces. There was no ability to ameliorate that other than by directly demanding that they be responsive to some consumers' desires to get specific channels and not be forced to get others. He pursued that, and he would continue as a general matter to look at these issues in that way. You don't want markets that show unusual concentrations of power in any side of the equation.
Does he take the same approach, I guess, or he has made statements about the issues concerning media consolidation, especially concerns by some about newspaper ownership of television stations and the like?
Yes, this is a prevailing theme in his thinking. It is the case that I think this is a great example of how difficult it is to write firm rules and anticipate the explosion of the YouTube phenomenon, which has brought tremendous transparency to the political campaign in particular, but to life in general. And he's commented extensively about how the rise of YouTube has changed politics. It shines a light on candidates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in that way puts greater participation availability for the American consumer. It's harder for politicians, but he thinks that's a good thing. When you go back and look at, radio, television, and newspaper cross ownership and concentration, it would be hard to have anticipated the rise of these alternative outlets, and you want to look comprehensively to make sure that there's not too much power, but not just narrowly.
And then how does he achieve the balance then of looking at that while making sure the free market system works that he approaches?
It is the question itself is practically the answer. It's a balancing act, and the most important thing is to not be trapped by ideological desires to reflexively come down on one side or the other. Markets are effective when they're balanced, when customers have the ability to choose among alternatives, and when suppliers don't have the ability to choke off competition. In that way, you always want to have the ability to balance the scales and have flexible but good authorities in your regulators in order to achieve that.
Let's switch a little bit to broadband and the spread of broadband. And in his plan, he talks a little bit about tax credits for companies to build out service in areas that haven't necessarily had it in the past or low-income areas. I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about the issue of affordability. There doesn't seem to be an enormous amount in the plan about that. And one of the issues that seems to be rising up is that there's an enormous number of Americans, millions of Americans, still rely on dial-up service because they simply don't want to pay $30 or $50 a month for broadband service. So would a McCain administration have anything to talk about that issue?
Well, I think the important thing is to distinguish between those who don't want to pay for broadband and are content with the dial-up service because that's providing them with the the communications that they want, and the simple fact that in some cases broadband's not available and that the conventional business model won't penetrate those areas. He is deeply committed to having a wired nation, to giving people the opportunity to take advantage of faster services and the products that will come with it. His People Connect program, his desire to let communities provide broadband where the private sector decided not to, his willingness to put tax incentives out to firms in order to build out their networks. Those are all reflective of a recognition of how important this can be to give people this opportunity. It's an educational opportunity, it's a health opportunity, it's a business opportunity, certainly, and it's a way to draw together America and to share across these networks.
It seems like another issue, too. I mean, if we're looking at this realistically, you know, we've had basically 8 years of sort of hands-off style in terms of, you know, what happens with broadband penetration and allowing the markets to sort of take over. And it seems like one of the issues that still remains out there is broadband speed. And if you look at the speed of a typical American's broadband service compared to someone in Japan or the other industrialized nations, it's incredibly slow. And you know, it seems like does the McCain administration would they also believe that there's sort of a market failure there?
Well, there's a lot of competing statistics about both broadband penetration and whether we're measuring it correctly, giving people's access through schools and other things, about effective speeds versus what's on the top line. But McCain's deep belief, John McCain's commitment, is to provide the basic research and the scientific foundation for much greater technological innovation in the future. He believes that the private sector has led and can continue to lead this effort, but he is willing and committed to the kinds of extra incentives necessary to make sure that we connect these networks, and once they're connected and the demand for these services is present, he believes that we'll get faster speeds as a matter of the competitive pressures coming to bear on firms.
One of the issues regarding the internet over the years is the idea of taxation, especially when it becomes of access, taxing access. What's the senator's approach to whether the internet should be taxed or not?
He was one of the leaders of the internet tax moratorium, prohibiting new taxes on internet access. He would like to see it made permanent. He believes that in the same way, we're taxing mobile phones, which are a great device for hooking America together in the future. They're very heavily taxed, and he'd like to see us take a comparable approach to getting the taxes off those mobile phones as well.
When you mention mobile phones, legislative efforts looking at the strength that phone companies have, especially when it comes to things like fees or being able to cancel your service without excessive fees. What's the senator's thought on as far as the mobile phone companies, how they operate, and would he be interested in changing some of that model?
It's become a classic example of how technology allows narrow market segments, which used to be making a phone call on a mobile device, morph into broader connectivity, which if you look at a device now in people's hands, it is so much more than a phone. For that reason, he believes it really does merit close scrutiny to make sure that those marketplaces are working effectively, and we're not seeing a large amount of concentration of power and the high fees and taxes and other impediments to usage get in the way of the expansion of this.
So one of the ideas that has been floated at the FCC and may not actually get done before a next administration takes over is this idea of free broadband, wireless broadband services as part of an upcoming auction. Does the senator agree with the idea of having sort of national free broadband, wireless broadband?
He's allowed in legislative efforts in the past communities, particularly towns and cities, where the private sector has chosen not to provide wireless services, to allow them to step in and do it in that local area. And he thinks that model, using a sort of flexible and regional approach, is probably the most effective way to address this.
So he wouldn't be in favor of a national approach?
He has not set out a national approach for free wireless.
Okay, in terms of another issue that is also not likely to get done before the end of this year is USF and this enormous fund, which is only getting bigger. About 11% of your phone bill now goes into this fund to fund phone service in rural areas and for low-income folks. Has the senator thought about anything about what he'd like to do to reform USF?
He does not have a specific USF reform, but he has a long track record of being concerned about the inefficiencies, the failure to get good oversight and targeting of these funds, and the large amounts of money that are now going through the USF. He is interested in making sure that we have effective and targeted government programs. It is a theme of his campaign that we must restore to the American taxpayer the trust that Washington is spending their money wisely. That trust is badly broken at the moment. The USF is one example of that.
When the senator takes a look at innovative efforts, one of the things that come up, especially from the tech community, is that of high-tech visas and the amount that are available in the United States. Would the senator make an effort to increase that number?
Yes. He's, as part of his comprehensive immigration reform, as a recognition that America's education system is not producing a sufficient number of scientists, engineers, and technologists, he has proposed making H-1Bs much more market sensitive, expanding when there's need to provide the kinds of skills for our companies so we can keep those activities in the U.S. and compete around the globe.
When you talk about that, then, what happens initially when someone comes in under a visa, they work, they innovate, and then they head back to their country of origin? Would there be an effort to keep them here in the United States?
John McCain believes deeply that, number one, we need to make sure that we provide the education. We have an education system that is failing many of our young. We're not meeting our obligation to educate them, have them leave high school prepared to go college, having them finish a college education and pursue advanced degrees. That is a commitment that he has made to the American people, fully funding things like the America Competes Act. If that's not sufficient, we will need to draw on the global labor pool to get the skills in the United States to build these products, and the visa reform is one part of that. It is sadly one of those issues that got dropped in the comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, as you know, he led the battle, left the campaign at a time when it was not in his narrow political interest to try to accomplish comprehensive immigration reform, stood with Ted Kennedy, tried to get it through the Senate, did not succeed, sadly. It remains something that he would like to do as president, and the H-1B reforms would be part of that.
So one of the ideas that Senator Obama came out with in his tech plan, which was released last November, I think, at Google, was this idea of having a chief technology officer, and that the FCC really isn't designed to be dealing with some of the high-tech issues that are now coming up, and that someone else needs to be in charge of that sort of thing. Does Senator McCain share that idea?
The senator wants to have an effective government. I don't think, making a new presidential appointment and adding a layer to the federal government is a solution to that. And he would prefer to see a government really overhauled for the 21st century. We have an opportunity as the baby boom nears retirement. It will include many government employees. We have not seen the penetration into the federal government of the same kinds of information-based techniques that have transformed private sector management. He is very interested in and talking to executives in the private sector about what we can do to have a 21st century government that is responsive to the needs of taxpayers, that embodies the best of these technological advances, and would by reflex then be sensitive to the needs of the technology community in conducting its policies.
Isn't that one of the ideas, though, that if you don't have one person in charge of something like that, that some of this sort of gets lost in the translation, and you could get someone like a John Chambers to come in and be that guy?
You can place that authority in the Vice President of the United States. You could certainly tap the head of your science efforts in the administration to be someone at the technology end of it. I think the senator is fully committed to making sure that he gets effective leadership and quality talent in his administration, should he be so fortunate as to be elected. The label, I think, is the less important thing. And the senator has a great track record of doing the things that the tech community has valued. His leadership in keeping taxes low, in opening trade, which has been a foundation of our technological advances, and the productivity booms that we saw in the late 1990s, many of which coincided with lower taxes on capital gains, trade agreements that took the tariffs off the important technological products. Those are signature John McCain efforts. He has a great track record in the Science Committee and the Commerce Committee. So he's not going to have to put in place a single figurehead to gain the confidence of the tech community. He has that confidence through his track record and his efforts.
Given his background, and on another issue, how has the senator weighed in on the process of the transition to digital television?
He has been a leader in trying to hurry this transition. He believes deeply that our first responders deserve to have the ability to communicate. We have seen the tragic consequences in 9/11 and in Katrina of ineffectual communications among first responders. He is fully committed to pursuing this digital transition on as timely basis as is possible.
Does he think that the public is being effectively educated on this?
Certainly there is an education effort. As we draw closer to the key date next year, we'll be able to find out how effective that education has been, but it's certainly something to keep monitoring.
As part of that, it seems like you know, that's going to be one of the first big things that happens after next administration takes over, and there is a lot of concern, I think, on the Hill and among broadcasters that consumers won't be ready and that everyone's going to wait till the last minute, they won't be able to get the boxes hooked up and this, that, and the other. Would the senator be open to a slight delay of the transition or of a couple months?
It is not his first choice to delay this any further. This is a pressing issue of national security in some cases, and having these responders be able to communicate. Proactive efforts between now and the transition are far better than a delay at the time.
Okay.
One more question. We talked and started this conversation looking at his general approach to these kind of issues. How does his general approach differ from his opponent?
Well, I think there really is no comparison in terms of a track record in this area. Years as chairman on the Commerce Committee. I think there's really no comparison in terms of the breadth of his commitment to the things that have been successful in technology. International trade, where Senator Obama has been hardly steadfast and, quite frankly, used trade as an issue of political expediency at times. The commitment to low taxes, which the tech community has spoken about very much. The need to have fundamentally strong education, the ability to fund the America Competes Act, commitment to research and development, and immigration reform. Those are the issues where John McCain has been a leader. John McCain has done the hard things to solve real problems for America, and Barack Obama has taken positions on the campaign.
If you are interested, for those of you watching at home, in finding out more about the senator's plan, you can go to their website, John McCain for President, and find out more about the plan that is laid out today. Our guest, Douglas Holtz-Eakin of John McCain for President, thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Amy Schatz, thank you for your time as well.
Thanks so much.
And thank you both for being on the Communicators.